Lecture 32, The Dialectic Between the Person and the Environment. To complete our overview of the reciprocal interactions between the person, his or her behavior, and the environment, we examine the dialectic between the person and the environment, how environments go beyond eliciting behavior to shape the people in them, and how people reciprocally shape the environments in which their behavior takes place. And we'll begin with the effect of the environment on the person. The influence of the environment on the person is really just a continuation of the traditional social psychological literature on social influence. In the last lecture, we looked at the influence of the environment, especially the social environment, on the behavior of the individual. But Allport's definition of social psychology makes it clear that social influence extends beyond the individual's overt behavior to affect the individual's thoughts and feelings as well. So in this first portion of the lecture, we want to look at how the social environment, the actual, imagined, or implied presence of other human beings and their behavior, affects the individual's internal states and dispositions, his or her thoughts and beliefs and feelings, desires, traits, attitudes, and values. These are the internal states and dispositions that cause people to behave the way they do. For example, there's an extensive social psychological literature on the effects of persuasive communications on attitudes. In one study, Janis and his colleagues asked subjects to read a set of essays on various controversial topics. Now, this study was published in 1965. It's a genuine classic in social psychology. So the topics that Janis studied were controversial then. Whether the federal government should invest money to find a cure for cancer, whether there should be an increase in military spending, whether the government should invest heavily in the space program to put a man on the moon, and whether the viewing of 3D movies should be prohibited on health grounds. The essays were specifically written to be either pro or con, to favor or to be opposed on each issue. Half the subjects read essays favoring the various topics, half the subjects read essays opposed to the various proposals. In addition, half the subjects in each group was offered a snack while they read the essays. The other half of the subjects were not. After reading each essay, the subjects were simply asked to rate the extent to which they agreed with the argument being made in the essay. That is, the extent to which they agreed with the persuasive communication. The important finding of the experiment was that subjects who snacked while they read the essays were more likely to agree with the argument in the essays, regardless of the topic, moonshot or 3D movies, and regardless of the position the essay took, pro or con. Eating while they read, that's a feature of the environment, the provision of food, affected the subject's agreement with the argument, an internal attitudinal state. Here at the University of California, Berkeley, it's a tradition for graduate students taking their exams to provide snacks for the faculty who are examining them. Maybe this tradition has its origins in Janis's experiment. Another example of situational influence on the individual's internal mental states comes in the domain of interpersonal attraction. Liking someone is a special case of an attitude because it represents a favorable evaluation of that person. And as you might imagine, there's a very large social psychological literature that explores the determinants of interpersonal attraction, what leads us to like someone else. Obviously, our attitudes towards other people are determined partly by what are known as target characteristics, features of the person who's the target of our evaluation. For example, we tend to like other people who are physically attractive, no surprise there, competent, especially if they occasionally make some endearing mistake, and similar to ourselves. It turns out it's pretty much a myth that opposites attract. But situational characteristics, that is, features of the situation in which we encounter the target person, are also powerful determinants of attraction and can lead us to like a person even if he or she is not particularly attractive, competent, or similar to ourselves. One of these environmental factors is sheer proximity. We tend to like people who are physically near us, physically close. Here's an example from a study by Siegel on friendship patterns that developed among police recruits studying at the Maryland State Police Academy. In the academy, the recruits were housed in dormitories and seated in classrooms in strict alphabetical order. That is, all the recruits with names beginning with letters early in the alphabet sat near each other and lived near each other, as did all the recruits with names beginning with late letters in the alphabet. As part of a survey conducted after their training concluded, the students were asked to nominate their 3 closest friends on the force. And Siegel found that there was a high correlation between the last name of the recruit who was surveyed and the last names of his or her friends when those friends had been in the academy with the person. So if your last name began with A or B or C, you tended to nominate as friends fellow academy graduates whose names also began with A or B or C, and so on all the way down the line. The figure, which comes from Siegel's paper, shows an extraordinarily high correlation between the alphabetical order of the person surveyed and the alphabetical ranking of those he or she nominated as friends. Of course, it's one thing to have a friend, and another thing to have that person nominate you as a friend. And in fact, this worked both ways. Reciprocal friendships, that is, friendships that were reciprocated, were much more likely to occur among people who had lived and studied together than those who had not. Siegel concluded that propinquity contributes to positive affect, and in fact, propinquity, defined this way, was the strongest by far of all the determinants of the friendship patterns. There have been lots of studies done like this, and they all yield pretty much the same findings. Friendship varies as a function of distance. The closer two people are physically, the more likely they are to be friends. This is true within towns, friendship patterns within suburban tracts, in which everyone moved in at approximately the same time and everyone was of roughly the same socioeconomic status. It also holds true within living units, such as dormitories, and within a classroom. Despite the occasional horror story, roommates generally get along remarkably well, considering how they came together. And students often strike up friendships with those who just happen to sit next to them in class. Workplace romances occur because the parties simply have frequent contact with each other. What's really important, though, it turns out, is not so much sheer physical proximity, but rather functional distance. How much effort is required to make and maintain contact, and the availability of the other person as a friend. A neighbor with whom you share a yard is more likely to be a friend than one whose yard is separated from yours by a fence. If your dormitory room is near the bathroom, the elevator, or a stairwell, you're likely to have more friends, just because of the number of people passing by your door and the frequency with which they do it. Functional distance creates availability, and availability means exposure and familiarity. And it turns out that familiarity doesn't breed contempt, it breeds liking. The role of familiarity in evaluation and positive affect is dramatically illustrated by a series of studies performed by Robert Zients on what he called the mere exposure effect. In the first of these experiments, subjects recruited for an experiment on language learning were taught to pronounce unfamiliar, meaningless material that was presented to them as either Turkish words or Chinese ideographs. The words weren't really Turkish and the ideographs weren't really Chinese, but that's what they looked like and that's how they were presented to the subjects. During the experiment, individual items were presented to the subjects from 1 to 25 times in a sort of verbal learning experiment. Afterwards, the subjects were told that the items were adjectives. This too was false, but that's what they were told, and they were simply asked to guess whether each item had a good or a bad meaning on a rating scale that went from 0 to 6. So the experiment varied the amount of exposure to the words or the ideographs, and the subjects were simply asked to guess whether the symbol represented something good or something bad. And here are the basic results of the experiment. Control items that the subjects had never been seen before, 0 exposures, tended to receive slightly negative ratings on the evaluation scale. But items that had been encountered previously were more favorably rated, and the favorable evaluations increased with the number of repetitions. Almost every item employed in the study was rated more favorably if it had been presented many times as opposed to just a few times, or in the control condition, not presented at all. Remember, these subjects had no idea what these words meant, not least because they didn't mean anything. But if they had seen them a lot before, they tended to like them. If they hadn't, they tended not to. The mere exposure effect, that's what Zients called it, occurs when repeated exposure increases judgments of attractiveness, likability, or any other favorable evaluation, even in the absence of any substantive contact with the objects being rated. Because likability is an expression of preference, and preference is an attitude, the mere exposure effect is a purely situational effect on the person. Apparently, people tend to prefer whatever it is that they encounter frequently in their environment. A particularly clever demonstration of the mere exposure effect was performed by Theodore Mita and his colleagues, and I have to confess this is one of my favorite social psychological experiments. It's an experiment in which subjects were asked to make judgments of photographs of people's faces, including their own. The subjects were presented with pairs of near identical photographs of women, in which one photograph was the mirror reversal of the other, and asked to indicate which one they preferred. Here you see a photograph of the American actress Marilyn Monroe with her beauty mark on her left cheek, and on the right the mirror reversal of that photograph showing how Monroe looked to herself. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw her beauty mark on her right cheek. So in this experiment, some of the subjects were the same women whose faces appeared in the photographs, while other subjects were their friends in one study or their romantic partners in another. The idea was that people should prefer the photograph that offers the view of the person with which they themselves were more familiar. Acquaintances should prefer the original photograph because that's the way the person appears to them. But the subjects of the photographs themselves should prefer the mirror reversed images because that's the way they appear to themselves in a mirror. And that's exactly what Mita and his colleagues found. Friends and romantic partners preferred the true photographs, but people themselves preferred the mirror reversed photographs. People prefer photographs that represent the view they've encountered most frequently. This is the mere exposure effect on attractiveness, and it's a purely situational effect. Having examined some of the ways in which people are affected by their environments, let's turn the tables and look at some of the ways in which people affect their environments. Of course, this returns us to the doctrine of interactionism, which, you'll remember, asserts that situations are as much a function of the person as the person's behavior is a function of the situation. The doctrine of interactionism, in turn, begs the question of mechanism. Precisely how can people affect their environments? In general, we can identify 4 different mechanisms. First, evocation, where the mere presence of a person in an environment alters that environment, independent of his or her traits, attitudes, or behaviors. Second, selection, where people deliberately choose to enter one environment as opposed to another, perhaps out of a desire to match their environments with their personalities or with their goals. Third, behavioral manipulation, in which people engage in overt behavioral activities that alter the objective environment, that is, the environment as it's publicly experienced by everybody who's in it. And then finally, cognitive transformation, in which people engage in covert mental activities that alter their mental representations of their subjective environment, that is, the environment as they perceive it, and privately experience it. First, let's look at evocation. By evocation, we mean that the person's mere presence in the environment alters that environment, independent of his or her actual behavior, and in fact, even in the absence of any behavior at all. Evocation works chiefly by eliciting behavior from others which changes the environment for everyone. It can occur completely unintentionally and even may be completely unconscious on everybody's part. Thus, the person's effect on the environment is not mediated by his or her behavior, at least in the sense of a deliberate voluntary act. Rather, the effect is produced by the person's mere presence, most likely by his or her physical appearance. We've already discussed one example of evocation in terms of mere presence effects. The mere presence of an audience can, under some circumstances, facilitate the individual's behavior and under other circumstances inhibit the individual's behavior. Here, the presence of a person in the environment changes the environment. But an even better example is gender role socialization. We're going to talk about this more in a later lecture, but for now let me simply make the point that at the moment of birth, the physical appearance of the newborn infant, whether he or she has recognizably male or female external genitalia, immediately structures the environment for that child. Beginning with whether you're dressed in pink or blue, the appearance of the child's external genitalia literally structures the environment so as to foster the development of the child as a normal little boy or a normal little girl according to prevailing sociocultural standards for gender role, for masculinity or femininity. Again, the infant, him or herself, hasn't done anything. He or she's just there, looking the way the child does. The process of evocation is nicely illustrated by what have come to be known as the Baby X studies. In these experiments, adult subjects are asked to assist in a study of infants' responses to strangers. The adults are asked simply to interact with an infant and are given some toys that they can use in the process. In the first study, the infant was in fact a 3-month-old girl, but the adults, who are actually university graduate students, were told that the child was either a girl or a boy or were given no information. And the point of the study is to see how the identification of the child by gender and name would affect the behavior of the adults. And, in fact, adults who thought they were interacting with a girl were much more likely to choose a doll as a prop for the interaction, as opposed to those who thought they were interacting with a boy. There wasn't any difference in the use of a football or a teething ring, which were also available as toys, but the doll showed a clear difference between adults who thought they were interacting with a boy and those who thought they were interacting with a girl. Moreover, men engaged in more physical contact with the child when it was identified as a boy, while women engaged in more physical contact with the very same child when it was identified as a girl. A follow-up study employed both male and female infants in order to control for the possibility that the adult's behavior in the first study had been shaped by subtly feminine behavior on the part of the infant, as unlikely as that may have been. Sometimes the boy was identified as a boy, sometimes as a girl. Sometimes the girl was identified as a girl, sometimes as a boy, and sometimes there was no particular identification. This study yielded more clear-cut differences. Adults dealing with a child identified as a boy were more likely to choose a football as a prop for the interaction, whereas adults dealing with a child identified as a girl were much more likely to use a doll as a prop. In the neutral condition, the dominant prop was the teething ring. It's as if the adults, not knowing whether the child was a boy or a girl, didn't know what else to do. The point is that the mere presence of the child and the child's identification as a little boy or a little girl evoked behavior from the other people in the environment, the adults in the environment. The identification of the child changed the environment, structured the environment, independent of anything the child, him or herself, actually did. Evocation is also exemplified by stereotyping and prejudice of all sorts. There are certain social categories like race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, even socioeconomic and educational status that are marked by physical or socio-demographic attributes. You're introduced to somebody and you can see that he's black or white, or that she has a Spanish or a Polish surname, or you have reason to believe that they're relatively poor or relatively wealthy or have a lot or only a little education. And classifying someone in terms of one of these social categories can change our behavior towards that person, irrespective of what he or she actually thinks or feels or does. Perhaps the overriding social category is whether someone's a member of an out-group compared to our own in-group. Members of outgroups, whether that outgroup status is based on race or ethnicity or gender or anything else, tends to evoke prejudicial behavior on the part of members of in-groups. In the presence of an outgroup member, in-group members will almost inevitably behave differently than they would if the outgroup member were not present at all. Gender and racial stereotyping and gender and racial prejudice doesn't require any behavior on the part of the person who's on the receiving end of the stereotyping and prejudice. They just have to be there and be who they are. The critical feature of evocation is that the person need not do anything to change the situation. His or her mere presence and appearance is sufficient to evoke behavior from other people that changes the situation for everyone. The notion of selection entails the idea that the match between persons and their environments is not random. Rather, individuals commonly choose environments that are congruent with their personalities, with their traits, their attitudes, their beliefs, their moods, their goals, and their values. In this way, people place themselves in environments that tend to support and promote their own behavioral tendencies. The selection of the situation is not a trivial effect. Each choice we make preempts alternatives. Thus, choosing an environment that supports our current habits and attitudes effectively precludes us from being in an environment that would lead us to change those habits or attitudes. This can result in a kind of positive feedback loop between the person and the environment, with the person choosing compatible environments and the environment eliciting behaviors that make it unlikely that the person will choose some different environment. Every choice we make of this sort effectively changes our environment, whether it's choice in dating or in which college you're going to go to or which city or neighborhood you're going to live in. Here's an example of selection at work. It's a study by David Buss of personality and mate preference. Recall from our earlier discussion of interpersonal attraction that similarity attracts. People tend to like others who are like them in personality and attitudes. Buss measured his subjects' personalities in terms of the Big Five personality traits, and then asked them to indicate, by means of an adjective checklist, the psychological qualities that they would prefer in a mate. It turns out there was a high correlation between personality and preference. Extroverts preferred mates who were extroverted. Conscientious people preferred mates who were conscientious. Neurotics even preferred mates who were neurotic. Our friends, our companions, our mates are very important aspects of our environment. By selecting mates with personalities that are similar to ours, we help ensure that our environments will be compatible with our own personalities. In a sense, this selection of the environment by the individual is the opposite of Darwinian selection by the environment. While it's true that the environment favors people with certain kinds of traits, it's also true that people with certain kinds of traits favor certain kinds of environments. Selection of the environment by the person is ubiquitous. Every personal choice we make changes the environment in which the person resides and in which his or her behavior takes place. Each of us in the course of our life plays a number of different social roles: professor or student, friend, husband, brother, son, whatever, and each of these imposes different role demands on the individual. In a sense, each of these different social roles that we play is a different environment, and choosing to play one forecloses choosing to play the others, at least temporarily. Each choice we make opens up some opportunities and imposes some demands, but it also closes off some opportunities and relieves us of some demands. Sometimes we choose our environments for ourselves, sometimes the choices are made for us by other people. But in any event, every act of selection literally changes the person's environment because it puts the person in one behavior setting rather than another. But what if you find yourself in a situation you didn't choose, or for some other reason the environment just isn't quite right? It turns out that people have the capacity to alter their environments through their behavior, through activity that changes the actual character of the environment. We all know somebody who can turn any situation into a party, and most of us, unfortunately, also know people who can turn any party into a funeral. In behavioral manipulation, the person engages in overt, publicly observable behavior that alters the environment, and alters it objectively, publicly, for everyone who's also in that environment. In some respects, it seems almost superfluous to cite examples of behavioral manipulation of the environment. As I indicated earlier, every act of instrumental or operant behavior changes the organism's environment in some way. The rat who presses the key in an operant chamber changes the environment from one that doesn't contain food into one that does. But let's look at a couple of experiments anyway. Consider first a famous problem in game theory, a paradigm often used to study interpersonal behavior, a problem known as the prisoner's dilemma. Two individuals have been arrested on suspicion of armed robbery. The prosecutor doesn't have enough evidence to convict, so he makes each of them the following offer. If neither suspect confesses, both will get light sentences because the prosecutor will be able to convict them on lesser charges. If both suspects confess, they will both get reduced sentences because they will save the prosecutor the cost of a trial and the risk of acquittal. But if one suspect confesses and turns state's evidence, he will get a very short sentence, while the prosecutor will throw the book at the one who held out. Under these circumstances, there really isn't a logical response, which is why it's called a dilemma. But there are two choices. One is cooperation, in which both subjects stay silent, and that maximizes their joint outcome. They'll both get light sentences. The other possibility is competition, in which one suspect rats out the other one, maximizing his personal outcome at the expense of the other suspect. Cooperation maximizes their joint outcome, but cooperation entails trust that the other suspect will not defect and confess. Similarly, competition maximizes the defector's personal outcome, but if both of them try to defect, if both of them confess, they'll both get longer sentences than they would if they stayed silent. Under these circumstances, there's often an initial tendency to compete. However, as the game is played over multiple trials, gradually the players will tend to evolve into a cooperative strategy. Both players eventually figure out that it's in both their best interests to remain silent. Kelly and Stahelski used the prisoner's dilemma to look at the relationship between cooperators and competitors as the game is played out over time. Their subjects played a standard prisoner's dilemma game, like the one I just discussed, for 3 blocks of 10 trials each. At the outset of the game, the investigators assessed the subjects' initial goals, whether they intended to cooperate or to compete, and then looked at what happened when various combinations of cooperators and competitors were pitted against each other in the game. The results were quite striking. Cooperative actors paired with cooperative partners consistently made cooperative choices, and this tendency actually increased across the 3 blocks of 10 trials. But cooperative actors paired with competitive partners actually made fewer cooperative moves. It was as if the competitive behavior of their partners actually made the actors behave in a more competitive fashion. Put another way, the behavior of the competitor changed the environment for the cooperator. Competitive actors paired with cooperative partners made very few cooperative responses at the outset and actually made even fewer as the game went on. They seemed to take advantage of their partners' cooperative spirits, or to put it another way, they played their partners for saps. The cooperative behavior of the partner created a situation where the competitive actor could take advantage. And finally, competitive actors paired with competitive partners seemed to get involved in a vicious cycle of competition. It took quite a while for cooperation to evolve when these two were paired together, if it ever did. Kelly and Stahelski referred to this effect as the behavioral assimilation of cooperators to competitors. In other words, the competitors, by their competitive behavior, created an environment that elicited competitive behavior even from cooperators. The behavior changed the environment. We can also see the effects of overt behavior on the environment in the delay of gratification situation. But to understand this, let's take a step back and look at a situational influence on delay of gratification. This study used the reward choice paradigm that I described earlier. The children were asked which of 2 rewards, cookies or pretzels, they preferred. And then they were told that the experimenter was going to go away for a while, actually about 15 minutes. If they waited for the experimenter to return, they'd receive their preferred reward, but if they could not wait, they would receive their non-preferred reward. Then the experimenter left. In one condition of the experiment, he took the cookies and pretzels with him. In other conditions, he left one or the other behind. And in a fourth condition, he left them both behind. Children who waited in the absence of both rewards were able to wait a fairly long time. Some of them even outlasted the experimenter. If either the preferred or the non-preferred reward was left with the child, waiting time decreased. And if the child was left to wait in the presence of both rewards, waiting time dropped almost to 0. Young children simply cannot delay gratification long when they're delaying in the presence of a reward. And the experiment clearly shows the influence of the situation, whether the rewards are present or not, on the child's behavior. That's all well and good. There's a situational influence on delay of gratification behavior, but we're not really interested in situational influences here. We're interested in the person's influence on the situation. It turns out that some children actually are able to delay for a fairly long time, even in the presence of their preferred reward, which led Michel and his colleagues to ask the simple question, how do they do it? How do high delay children delay for a long period of time? Michel and his colleagues actually observed the children during the delay period, and they discovered that they engaged in behaviors that effectively put the rewards out of sight. They might have avoided deliberately looking at the rewards, or covering their eyes with their hands, or resting their heads on their arms. Or they generated their own diversions. They talked or sang quietly to themselves. They played little games with their hands or their feet. Some of the children even tried to go to sleep during the interval. In other words, faced with a situation not of their choosing, in which they were forced to wait in the presence of one or both of the rewards, the children actively manipulated the situation through their overt behavior to create a situation in which it was possible to delay. Through their behavior, they effectively put the rewards out of sight, and in that way increased their ability to delay gratification. The kids took control and changed the situation. A formal experiment by Michel and his colleagues put this strategy to the test. Children were given the choice between marshmallows or pretzels, and then had to wait for the experimenter to return before they could receive their preferred reward. All the children had to wait in the presence of the reward, but some children were given a slinky toy that they could play with, effectively distracting themselves from the reward. Those children who were given nothing to do couldn't wait very long, but those who were given the slinky toy to play with were able to wait much longer. Their overt behavior, playing with the distracting slinky toy, effectively created a situation in which they were able to wait for a fairly long period of time. Rewards can be physically absent, as in the case of situational influence, and when they're physically absent, kids can wait. Or the children can do something to make them absent, in which case the children are altering the environment through their own behavior. Even when we have no choice over our environment, and we're unable to manipulate it through our overt behavior, we can still change the environment effectively through covert cognitive operations, by changing how we perceive the environment, or the private subjective meaning that we give the environment. In this case, the environment is changed through cognitive activity, not overt behavior, through cognitive transformation. Cognitive transformation alters our mental representation of the environment. And remember, from a cognitive point of view, it's the perceived environment, not the objective environment, that determines our behavior. Whereas behavioral manipulation alters the objective environment, cognitive transformation alters the subjective mental representation of the environment. For an example of the power of cognitive transformation, let's stick with delay of gratification and explore another condition of the slinky experiment. Remember, in this experiment, children were able to delay for a long time, even in the presence of the promised rewards, if they were able to distract themselves with a slinky toy. But it turns out that the distraction doesn't have to involve overt behavior, like playing with a toy. In another condition of this experiment, the children were simply instructed to spend their time thinking of anything that's fun to think of. These children were able to delay gratification even longer than those who played with a slinky toy. Instead of thinking about the rewards, they thought of something else that was fun to think of, and that thinking allowed them to delay gratification. The rewards were still there, but the cognitive transformation allowed them to delay for a long time, even longer than when they had access to the slinky toy. An experiment by Michel and Baker further illustrates the power of cognitive transformation in the delay of gratification situation. In this experiment, the children were given the usual choice of marshmallows versus pretzels, and during the waiting period, the preferred reward remained in sight. In one condition of the experiment, the children were instructed to spend the waiting period thinking about the consummatory aspects of the reward, how it would feel and taste when they finally got to eat it. In another condition of the experiment, the children were instructed to transform the reward into something they could not eat. In each condition, half the children were instructed to think about their preferred reward, whether it was marshmallows or pretzels. In the other condition, to think about their non-preferred reward. The results of the experiment were very striking. Children who focused their thoughts on the consummatory aspects of their preferred reward, how it would taste, how it would feel in their mouths, were not able to delay gratification for very long. But those who transformed their preferred reward into something that did not taste sticky sweet like marshmallows or crunchy salty like pretzels were able to delay for a long time. What caused these children to delay, or not, was not their personality traits, not the environment, not even their own behavior. The important factor was how they thought about the rewards. So the notion of delay of gratification as a trait that some people have and other people don't really is an oversimplification. Ego control is not just a personality characteristic, it's something we do. It's a product of strategic activity. The child may choose to wait in the absence of reward. Children who select an environment that's free of temptation will be able to wait longer than those who do not. But if such an environment is not possible, children can manipulate the environment through their behavior by avoiding looking at the rewards or distracting themselves from them that changes the character of the environment. And if these behaviors are not possible, if, just to be silly for a minute, we tie the child upright in the chair facing the reward, tape his eyes open and his mouth shut, that child can still transform the environment through purely mental operations by not thinking about the rewards or by thinking about the rewards in a different way. By changing the perception of the situation, by changing the meaning of the situation, his behavior changes as well. Through the processes of social learning, children acquire both their knowledge of effective behavioral and cognitive strategies for delaying gratification and the ability to deploy these strategies effectively. And what's true for children in the delay of gratification situation is true for adults, for all of us, in almost every situation we're in. Our generalized traits and attitudes are not strong predictors of actual behavior in specific situations, because actual behavior is also determined by the specific details of the evoking situation. But the situation itself is not independent of the person. Setting aside evocation and selection, people can manipulate the objective situation through their overt behavior, and people can transform the subjective situation through mental operations by changing how they perceive, interpret, categorize the situation that they're in. But cognitive transformations don't just alter the subjective environment of the perceiver, they can also alter the objective environment of other people as well as the perceiver, because these cognitive transformations have behavioral consequences. Our behavior is determined by our perceptions, our memories, our expectations, our beliefs. By changing our cognitions, our behavior changes accordingly, and that behavior alters the environment for everybody else in it. That beliefs can create reality is dramatically illustrated by a study by Rosenthal and Jacobson known as Pygmalion in the Classroom, an experiment involving children, grades 1 through 6, who were enrolled in a number of public elementary schools. Early in the fall one school year, the children were administered what was presented to the teachers and school administrators as a nonverbal IQ test that would identify intellectual late bloomers. That is, children who might not be doing well now, but who could be expected to catch up and even exceed the achievement of their age peers. In fact, the test had nothing to do with IQ or the prediction of late blooming. It was a fake. Nevertheless, the teachers were given false feedback about their pupils' test scores, identifying a random 20% of pupils in each class as late bloomers. This designation had nothing to do with the children's actual scores on that test. At the same time in the fall, the children had received a standard IQ test, and later in the spring of that same academic year, the children were retested with another version of that IQ test. On average, children in all classes and grade levels showed increases. School really does make you smarter. But those children who had been falsely identified as intellectual late bloomers showed greater gains than the other children. Of course, the children weren't really late bloomers, but their teachers believed that they were, and they treated them accordingly. Thus, the effect of the cognitive transformation, identifying some students as late bloomers, was mediated by behavioral manipulations, treating students identified as late bloomers differently than the other students. The teachers were warmer and more open to the late bloomers. They provided more feedback to the late bloomers about when their performance was good and bad. They gave late bloomers more and more difficult assignments. And they actually gave late bloomers more time to answer questions instead of cutting them off, and did more to shape and encourage their responses. In other words, teachers who believed that a child was a late bloomer behaved as if that child were already doing well. And by treating late bloomers as if they were already smart, they created a different environment for the late bloomers than for the other children, who after all were in the same physical classroom. And not surprisingly, the late bloomers responded by blooming. As you might imagine, the Pygmalion in the Classroom study was very controversial when it was published and remains somewhat controversial today. But its essential conclusions have been supported by hundreds of studies performed since then. The Pygmalion effect itself is an example of a broader class of phenomena characterized by the sociologist Robert K. Merton as the self-fulfilling prophecy, a false definition of the situation which evokes a new behavior which makes the originally false conception come true. Such effects are sometimes known as behavioral confirmation effects, where an actor's expectancy elicits behavior from a target that confirms the actor's expectancy. But sometimes the target's behavior is ambiguous. In this case, the ambiguous behavior of the target is likely to be interpreted or perceived by the actor as confirming his expectancy. This is known as a perceptual confirmation effect. The three dialectics in social interaction, and especially the various ways in which persons create the situations to which they respond, illustrates the complex nature of personality and social interaction. The person, the environment, and behavior do not constitute a simple system in which the various components are independent of each other and causation goes only in one direction. Rather, the person, the environment, and behavior constitutes a complex system in which the components interact and causation is bidirectional. This complex system makes personality and social interaction difficult to grapple with experimentally sometimes, but it also makes personality and social interaction the most fascinating aspect of the science of mind and behavior.